I never imagined that saving someone's life would become the biggest mistake I ever made. The man I pulled from that underground tomb whispered a secret that shattered everything I believed about my family's death. My name is Sarah, and I grew up in the poorest part of Millbrook County, where the soil was too rocky for decent crops and opportunities were as scarce as rain in summer. Our small farmhouse sat on 15 acres of stubborn land that my grandfather had bought with his life savings back in 1962. The paint peeled from the wooden siding like old skin, and the roof leaked in 3 different places every time it stormed. My parents, Martha and David Collins, worked harder than anyone I knew. Dad spent his days fixing farm equipment for neighbors and doing odd construction jobs in town. His hands were permanently stained with grease and calloused from decades of manual labor. Mom cleaned houses for the wealthy families who lived in the hills above our valley. She would leave before dawn and return after sunset, smelling of other people's cleaning products and carrying stories about marble bathrooms and walk-in closets bigger than our entire kitchen. We lived simply, but we lived with dignity. Mom grew vegetables in our small garden behind the house, tomatoes, beans, carrots and potatoes that helped stretch our grocery budget through the long winter months. Dad taught me how to fix engines and patch roofs. He said a person who could work with their hands would never starve. I believed him then. Our evening meals were small but filled with conversation. Mom would tell us about the fancy houses she cleaned, describing crystal chandeliers and imported tile floors. Dad would share stories from his day, usually involving some piece of machinery that had broken down in an interesting way. I would talk about school, where I maintained straight grades, despite wearing the same 3 outfits in rotation and carrying my books in a backpack held together with duct tape. Money was always tight, but we managed. We had each other, and that felt like enough. Our neighbors, the Hendersons and the Morales family, were in similar situations. We helped each other during harvest time and shared resources when someone's car broke down or medical bills piled up. There was a sense of community in our struggle that I now realize was precious. I spent my free time exploring the countryside around our property. Miles of abandoned farmland stretched in every direction, dotted with old barns and forgotten wells. Some properties had been empty for decades, their owners having moved to cities or lost their land to debt. I knew every path through those fields, every creek that ran after heavy rains, every stand of trees that provided shade during hot summer afternoons. The old Blackwood estate sat on the highest hill in our area, its massive Victorian mansion visible from our kitchen window on clear days. Everyone knew the story of how the Blackwood family had owned most of the county a century ago before losing their fortune in some business scandal. The house had been empty for as long as anyone could remember, though someone still paid to keep the grounds maintained. Everything changed during the spring of my senior year in high school. Heavy rains had been falling for 3 weeks straight, turning our dirt roads into muddy rivers and flooding several basements in town. I was walking home from school through the old Carpenter property when I heard something strange. A tapping. Sound was coming from somewhere underground, rhythmic and desperate. I followed the sound to what looked like an old storm cellar, partially hidden by overgrown weeds and fallen branches. The wooden doors were secured with a heavy chain and padlock, but the tapping was definitely coming from below. Someone was trapped down there. I called out to ask if anyone was there. A voice responded, weak but urgent. He told me his name was Marcus Blackwood and that he had been locked in the cellar for 2 days. He said he was hurt and needed help. Immediately, the voice sounded educated, refined in a way that was uncommon in our area. I ran home and returned with bolt cutters that Dad used for farm work. Breaking that chain felt wrong, like I was trespassing on something important, but I could not ignore someone who needed help. The cellar doors opened with a groan that seemed to echo across the empty fields. The man I found below was nothing like what I expected. Marcus Blackwood was probably 45 years old, well-dressed despite his circumstances, with silver hair and expensive-looking clothes that were now dirty and torn. He was sitting beside what looked like an ornate metal coffin, his left leg clearly injured. His eyes were sharp and intelligent, and when he looked at me, I felt like he was calculating something. He told me he had been exploring his family's old property when the cellar doors slammed shut above him. The lock had been tampered with, he said. Someone had trapped him deliberately. He had been surviving on bottled water he found in the cellar, but his injured leg was getting worse, and he was worried about infection. I helped him climb out of the cellar, supporting his weight as we made our way across the muddy field toward our house. He was heavier than he looked, and by the time we reached our front porch, both of us were exhausted. Mom was horrified when she saw us approach. A stranger in expensive clothes, injured and covered in dirt, was not something she encountered during her normal routine. Marcus Blackwood was charming and grateful. He thanked my parents repeatedly for their kindness and insisted on paying them for their trouble. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a wallet thick with cash, peeling off several $100 bills that represented more money than my family usually saw in a month. My parents were uncomfortable accepting payment for helping someone in need, but Marcus was persuasive. He told them I had saved his life and that he wanted to make sure our family was rewarded for our kindness. He said he was a businessman from Chicago who had come to settle some affairs related to his family's old property. Over the next few days, Marcus stayed in town while his leg healed. He took a room at the only decent hotel in Millbrook and made quite an impression on the locals. People were not used to seeing someone who dressed in tailored suits and drove a car that cost more than most houses in our neighborhood. He visited our house several times, always bringing gifts, expensive groceries, a new television to replace, our old one that had stopped working properly, and offers to help with bills that my parents were too proud to accept. He seemed genuinely interested in our lives, asking questions about our history in the area and listening intently to stories about local families. During one of these visits, Marcus mentioned that he was impressed with my intelligence and work ethic. He had learned that I was planning to attend community college in the fall, working part-time to pay for classes since we could not afford a traditional 4-year university. He offered to help with my education expenses, saying that someone with my potential deserved better opportunities. My parents were suspicious of such generosity from a stranger, but Marcus was persistent. He explained that his own family had been helped by kind strangers during difficult times, and that he believed in paying such kindness forward. He presented documents showing that he was indeed a successful businessman with legitimate credentials and financial means. The offer was tempting beyond belief: college tuition, books, living expenses, and even money for a reliable car so I could commute to classes. It would transform my future in ways that seemed impossible just weeks earlier. After many long discussions, my parents agreed to let Marcus sponsor my education, with the understanding that I would pay him back after graduation when I found a good job. Marcus had one condition. He wanted to show me something before finalizing our arrangement, something that would help me understand why education was so important and why I should never take opportunities for granted. He asked me to meet him at the old cellar where I had found him, saying there was something there that would change my perspective on life. I should have been suspicious. The whole situation was too convenient, too generous, too perfect. But I was 17 years old and desperate for a chance at a better future. The possibility of escaping the cycle of poverty that had trapped my family for generations was intoxicating. When I met Marcus at the cellar that evening, he seemed different, more serious, less charming than he had been during his visits to our house. He led me down into the underground space, which I now realized was much larger and more sophisticated than I had initially understood. The walls were lined with stone, and the metal coffin I had seen before was actually an ornate chest filled with old documents and photographs. Marcus opened the chest and began showing me papers that he said documented his family's history in the area. Property deeds, business contracts, and photographs of the Blackwood estate during its golden years. He spoke about the responsibility that came with wealth and power, and the importance of understanding how financial decisions affected entire communities. Then he showed me a folder that made my blood run cold. Inside were photographs of my grandfather's farm, my parents, and me. Pictures taken from a distance over a period of months, documenting our daily routines and activities. There were copies of financial records related to our property, medical bills from my mother's recent hospital stay, and detailed information about our family's debts and assets. I asked him why he had been watching us. That was when Marcus Blackwood told me the truth, the secret that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Emotional aftermath. Marcus explained that he had not been trapped in the cellar by accident. He had been waiting there, knowing that I walked through that area regularly on my way home from school. The whole scenario had been carefully planned to make me feel like a hero for saving him. But that was not the worst part. The worst part was what he told me next. Marcus Blackwood was not just a businessman from Chicago. He was the CEO of Blackwood Industries, a company that specialized in buying distressed properties from families who could not keep up with their mortgage payments. His company had been systematically targeting rural communities like ours, using legal loopholes and financial manipulation to acquire land for development projects. My grandfather had not died of natural causes 5 years earlier, as we had been told. He had committed suicide after receiving foreclosure papers from Blackwood Industries, papers that demanded immediate payment of a debt that had been artificially inflated through predatory lending practices. My grandfather had borrowed money to pay for medical treatments for my grandmother, using the farm as collateral. When he could not make the payments, Blackwood Industries had manipulated the terms of the loan to make it impossible for him to keep the property. The stress and shame of losing the farm that had been in our family for decades had been too much for my grandfather to bear. He had taken his own life in the barn behind our house, in the same spot where I had played as a child. My parents had found him there, but they had agreed with the local doctor to tell me it was a heart attack. They wanted to protect me from the truth. Blackwood Industries had eventually decided not to foreclose on our property because the land was not valuable enough for their development plans. But Marcus had kept our family under surveillance, watching to see if our financial situation might improve to the point where we could make the property more attractive for acquisition. My rescue of Marcus from the cellar had been a test. He wanted to see what kind of person I was, whether I could be useful to him in some way. My intelligence and determination had impressed him, and he had decided to make me an offer that would bind my family to him permanently. The college sponsorship was not generosity. It was an investment. Marcus planned to groom me to work for Blackwood Industries after graduation, using my background and local connections to help his company acquire more properties in rural communities. I would be the friendly local face that convinced struggling families to sign papers that would eventually cost them their homes. As Marcus explained his plan, I felt like the ground was disappearing beneath my feet. Everything I had believed about my family's history was a lie. My grandfather's death was not a tragedy of old age, but a murder committed through financial manipulation. The man I had saved was the same man who had destroyed my family years before I even knew he existed. I tried to leave the cellar, but Marcus blocked my path. He told me that I had already accepted his help and that my family was now obligated to honor our agreement. If I refused to cooperate with his plans, he would call in the debts that my parents had accumulated. Medical bills, property taxes, and maintenance costs that would force us into bankruptcy within months. He showed me documents that proved Blackwood Industries had been artificially inflating costs for services in our area. The contractors who repaired our roof, the mechanics who fixed our car, the medical providers who treated my mother, all of them had been charging prices that were higher than market rate and kicking back portions of their fees to Marcus's company. We had been trapped in a web of financial manipulation for years without knowing it. I finally understood why Marcus had been so interested in our family's history and daily routines. He had been calculating our financial vulnerabilities, looking for ways to increase our dependence on his assistance. The television, the groceries, the offers to help with bills, all of it had been designed to make us feel obligated to him. That night, I walked home in a daze. My parents were waiting in the kitchen, excited to hear about my meeting with Marcus and eager to finalize the college sponsorship arrangements. I could not bring myself to tell them what I had learned. They looked so hopeful, so proud that their daughter might have a chance at a better life. Instead, I went to my room and stared at the ceiling until morning came. I thought about my grandfather, alone in that barn, facing the loss of everything his family had worked to build. I thought about my parents, working themselves to exhaustion, while someone else profited from their desperation. I thought about all the other families in communities like ours who had been destroyed by people like Marcus Blackwood. For weeks, I went through the motions of normal life, while rage built inside me like pressure in a boiler. I attended classes, helped with chores, and smiled when my parents talked about college plans. But every night, I lay awake planning what I would do to Marcus Blackwood. I researched Blackwood Industries online, learning about their business, practices, and financial structure. I studied corporate law and real estate regulations, looking for weaknesses that could be exploited. I created fake social media profiles to connect with former employees and disgruntled customers, gathering information about the company's vulnerabilities. The more I learned, the angrier I became. Blackwood Industries had destroyed hundreds of families across the Midwest using the same tactics they had used on us. They would identify struggling rural communities, manipulate local service providers to inflate costs, then offer loans and assistance that created cycles of dependency. When property values rose enough to make development profitable, they would call in debts and force families into foreclosure. Marcus Blackwood was not just a businessman, he was a predator who fed on the desperation of people who had no other options. He had killed my grandfather as surely as if he had pulled a trigger, and he planned to use me to kill other people's grandfathers in the future. 3 months after our meeting in the cellar, I made my decision. I would not just refuse to cooperate with Marcus's plans. I would destroy him completely. Planning revenge against someone like Marcus Blackwood required patience and careful preparation. He had money, connections, and legal protection that made direct confrontation impossible, but he also had weaknesses that could be exploited by someone who understood his business model and psychological motivations. My first step was gathering evidence. I needed documentation of Blackwood Industries' predatory practices that would be convincing to law enforcement, media outlets, and regulatory agencies. This meant collecting financial records, correspondence, and testimony from victims across multiple states. I started by reaching out to families who had lost their properties to Blackwood Industries. Using social media and online forums, I found dozens of people with stories similar to my grandfather's. Farmers, small business owners, and retirees who had been manipulated into unsustainable debt arrangements and then forced into foreclosure when they could not pay. Many of these people were reluctant to talk about their experiences. They felt ashamed about losing their homes and suspicious of anyone asking questions about their financial problems. But I was persistent and empathetic. I shared my own family's story and explained that I was trying to build a case against the company that had hurt us all. Slowly, people began to trust me. They shared documents, recorded phone calls, and detailed accounts of their interactions with Blackwood Industries representatives. A pattern emerged of systematic fraud, manipulation, and abuse that went far beyond simple business practices. The evidence showed that Blackwood Industries routinely used shell companies to hide their ownership of local service providers. When they targeted a community for development, they would secretly acquire control of contractors, mechanics, medical providers, and other businesses that struggling families depended on. Prices would increase gradually, forcing residents to take out loans to pay for necessary services. These loans were structured with hidden fees, variable interest rates, and penalty clauses that made it nearly impossible for borrowers to understand their true obligations. When property values in the targeted area rose enough to make development profitable, Blackwood Industries would activate penalty clauses or change loan terms to force borrowers into default. The company employed teams of lawyers and accountants who specialized in exploiting legal loopholes and regulatory gaps. They knew exactly how to structure their schemes to stay just within the boundaries of criminal law while causing maximum financial damage to their victims. My next step was identifying key vulnerabilities in Marcus's operation. Despite their legal protections, Blackwood Industries had several weak points that could be attacked. Their business model depended on secrecy and public ignorance. If their practices became widely known, regulatory agencies would be forced to investigate and potential victims would be warned away from their schemes. The company also relied heavily on their reputation for legitimate business dealings. Marcus Blackwood served on several charitable boards and had received awards for community development work. His public image as a successful entrepreneur who helped struggling communities was essential to maintaining access to the political and financial networks that enabled his predatory practices. Finally, Blackwood Industries had grown rapidly by taking on significant debt to finance their property acquisitions. If their cash flow was disrupted or their credit rating was damaged, they would face serious financial problems that could threaten the entire organization. I developed a three-pronged attack strategy. First, I would compile all the evidence I had gathered into a comprehensive report that could be distributed to law enforcement, regulatory agencies, and media outlets simultaneously. Second, I would orchestrate a coordinated campaign to expose Marcus's practices to his business associates, charitable partners, and financial backers. Third, I would find a way to disrupt Blackwood Industries' cash flow at a critical moment when they were most vulnerable to financial pressure. Executing this plan required resources that I did not have. I needed legal advice, media contacts, and technical expertise that were beyond my capabilities as a high school student from a poor rural family. But I had one advantage that Marcus had not anticipated. The same intelligence and determination that had impressed him could be turned against him with devastating effect. I reached out to investigative journalists who specialized in corporate fraud, offering exclusive access to my evidence in exchange for their expertise and media platforms. I contacted attorneys who represented victims of predatory lending, proposing partnerships that would allow them to file class action lawsuits while I provided research and victim coordination. Most importantly, I established relationships with former Blackwood Industries employees who had quit because they were uncomfortable with the company's practices. These people had inside knowledge of current operations, upcoming deals, and internal vulnerabilities that would be crucial to timing my attacks for maximum impact. The planning process took 8 months. During that time, I maintained the pretense of cooperation with Marcus, while secretly building the network that would destroy him. I attended college using his sponsorship money, studied business and law, and developed the skills I would need to execute my revenge. Marcus checked in with me regularly, monitoring my progress and discussing future plans for my role in his organization. These conversations were torture, but they also provided valuable intelligence about his upcoming projects and strategic priorities. I recorded every interaction, building a file of evidence that would eventually be used against him in court. By the spring of my freshman year in college, everything was in place. I had documented evidence of fraud affecting over 200 families across 6 states. I had commitments from 3 major newspapers and 2 television news programs to run coordinated exposés. I had attorneys prepared to file lawsuits in multiple jurisdictions simultaneously. I had former employees ready to testify about internal company practices. Most importantly, I had identified the perfect moment to strike. Blackwood Industries was preparing to close on their largest deal ever, a development project that would require them to pay $200 million in cash within a 30-day window. If anything disrupted their financing during that critical period, the entire company would face bankruptcy. Marcus Blackwood had destroyed my family by exploiting our trust and desperation. He had killed my grandfather and planned to use me to kill other people's grandfathers. Now, it was time for him to learn what it felt like to lose everything he had worked to build. The revenge. The first phase of my revenge began on a Tuesday morning in March, when 3 major newspapers published front-page articles about Blackwood Industries' predatory lending practices. The stories, which I had spent months coordinating with investigative journalists, included detailed financial records, recorded conversations, and testimony from dozens of victims. The articles described how Marcus Blackwood had systematically targeted rural communities, manipulated local service providers to inflate costs, and trapped families in cycles of debt that inevitably led to foreclosure. They included photographs of abandoned homes and interviews with elderly people who had lost properties that had been in their families for generations. The media coverage was devastating for Marcus's carefully crafted public image. Within hours of publication, his photograph was being shared across social media platforms alongside stories of the families he had destroyed. The charitable organizations where he served on boards began receiving angry phone calls and demands for his resignation. But the newspaper articles were just the beginning. That same morning, attorneys in 6 different states filed class action lawsuits against Blackwood Industries, seeking damages for fraud, racketeering, and violations of federal lending regulations. The lawsuits were coordinated to create maximum legal pressure and prevent the company from using jurisdictional delays to avoid accountability. The third component of my attack involved Marcus's business associates and financial partners. I had prepared detailed reports documenting Blackwood Industries' practices and distributed them to every bank, investment firm, and corporate partner that did business with the company. The reports included evidence of criminal activity that made continued association with Marcus legally and financially dangerous. Within 48 hours, Blackwood Industries' primary lender had frozen their credit line pending a full investigation of their business practices. 2 major investment partners announced they were withdrawing from current projects and would not participate in future deals. The company's bond rating was downgraded to junk status, making it impossible for them to access capital markets. The timing of these attacks was not accidental. Marcus was in the middle of negotiations for his largest development project ever, a deal that required him to make a $200 million payment within 30 days. The sudden loss of credit and investment partners left him scrambling. to find alternative financing at the worst possible moment. I watched the chaos unfold from my college dormitory, monitoring news coverage and social media reactions, while maintaining the pretense of being a shocked and innocent observer. Marcus called me repeatedly during those first few days, asking if I had seen the news reports and expressing concern about how the negative publicity might affect my education funding. I played my role perfectly, expressing disbelief and disappointment about the allegations against him. I told him I was sure the charges were false and that I had complete faith in his integrity. These conversations were particularly satisfying because I could hear the desperation in his voice as his world collapsed around him. The fourth phase of my revenge involved the most personal betrayal. During one of our phone conversations, Marcus asked me to meet him in person to discuss how we should handle the crisis. He said he needed my help in dealing with the media and maintaining relationships with people in our local community who might be influenced by the negative coverage. I agreed to meet him at the same underground cellar where he had first revealed his true nature to me. The location was symbolic, and I wanted him to understand that I remembered every detail of his confession and the threats he had made against my family. When Marcus arrived at the cellar, he looked like a different person than the confident businessman who had manipulated my family months earlier. His expensive clothes were wrinkled, his hair was disheveled, and his face showed the strain of dealing with multiple legal and financial crises simultaneously. He began the conversation by trying to reassure me that the legal problems were temporary, setbacks that his attorneys would handle. He said the media coverage was based on misunderstandings and distortions that would be corrected once the facts were properly presented. He promised that my education funding would not be affected regardless of what happened to his company. I let him talk for several minutes, watching him struggle to maintain the facade of control and authority that had defined his interactions with my family. Then, I opened my laptop computer and began playing recordings of our previous conversations, including the session where he had explained his plans for my future and threatened my family with financial ruin. The expression on Marcus's face changed from confusion to recognition to horror as he realized what was happening. I told him that every conversation we had ever had was recorded, and that those recordings were now in the hands of law enforcement agencies and attorneys representing his victims. I explained how I had spent months building the network of journalists, lawyers, and former employees who had coordinated the attacks on his company. I described how I had identified the vulnerabilities in his business model and timed the assault to coincide with his most critical financial deadline. Most importantly, I told him about my grandfather. I wanted him to understand that his current destruction was not just about justice for his many victims, but personal revenge for the specific harm he had done to my family. I wanted him to know that the person he had tried to groom as his accomplice had instead become the architect of his downfall. Marcus tried several different approaches to regain control of the situation. First, he offered me money, promising to triple my education funding and provide additional payments for my silence. When I rejected his bribery attempts, he became angry and threatening, reminding me that he still had the power to call in my family's debts and force us into bankruptcy. I responded by showing him copies of the legal documents that had already been filed to challenge those debts in court. My attorney allies had reviewed every contract and loan agreement related to my family's financial obligations, and they had found multiple violations of federal lending regulations that would invalidate most of the claims against us. Finally, Marcus became desperate and pleading. He told me that destroying his company would hurt innocent employees and their families. He said that many of his development projects provided jobs and economic benefits to struggling communities. He begged me to call off the legal and media attacks in exchange for his promise to change his business practices. I listened to his pleas with the same cold calculation that he had shown when explaining how he had driven my grandfather to suicide. When he finished talking, I told him that I had considered the collateral damage his destruction might cause, and I had decided that it was an acceptable price for stopping him from hurting more families like mine. The final phase of my revenge unfolded over the following weeks as the combined legal, financial, and media pressure overwhelmed Blackwood Industries' ability to survive. The company missed its critical $200 million payment deadline, triggering default clauses in multiple contracts and forcing them into bankruptcy proceedings. Marcus's personal assets were frozen pending resolution of the fraud lawsuits, leaving him unable to maintain his expensive lifestyle or hire the team of attorneys he needed to fight the criminal charges that were now being filed against him. Several of his former business partners publicly distanced themselves from him, and he was forced to resign from all of his charitable board positions. The media coverage continued for months, with new stories appearing regularly as more victims came forward and additional evidence of fraudulent practices emerged. Marcus Blackwood became the public face of corporate greed and predatory lending, his name forever associated with the exploitation of vulnerable families. But the most satisfying aspect of my revenge was watching him experience the same helplessness and desperation that his victims had felt. The man who had systematically destroyed hundreds of families now knew what it was like to lose everything, to face financial ruin, and to have no control over forces that were tearing his life apart. Epilogue: 2 years have passed since I destroyed Marcus Blackwood's empire, and the consequences of my actions continue to ripple through both his life and mine. The criminal trials are still ongoing, but he has already been convicted on multiple counts of fraud and racketeering. He is currently serving a 15-year sentence in federal prison, and civil lawsuits have stripped him of virtually all his assets. The families who were victimized by Blackwood Industries received a measure of justice, though money can never fully compensate for the homes and security they lost. Many of them have been able to rebuild their lives with the settlement payments from the class action lawsuits, and several have thanked me personally for having the courage to expose Marcus's crimes. My own family's financial situation has improved dramatically. The legal challenges to our debts were successful, and we received a significant settlement as part of the class action lawsuit. My parents were able to pay off the mortgage on our farm and make improvements to the property that had been needed for years. I completed my college education using money from the settlement rather than Marcus's sponsorship. I studied journalism and law, skills that proved invaluable during the investigation and legal proceedings that followed my revelation of Blackwood Industries' practices. I'm now working as an investigative reporter, specializing in cases involving corporate fraud and predatory lending. The experience of planning and executing revenge against Marcus Blackwood changed me in ways that I am still discovering. I learned that I am capable of sustained deception, strategic thinking, and ruthless calculation when someone I love has been harmed. These are not necessarily admirable qualities, but they are useful ones in a world where people like Marcus exist. I also learned that revenge, while satisfying, comes with costs that are not always apparent at the beginning. The months I spent planning Marcus's destruction were consumed by anger and hatred that left little room for other emotions. I missed opportunities to build friendships and explore interests that might have enriched my life in healthier ways. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had chosen a different path after learning the truth about Marcus and my grandfather's death. I could have simply refused his sponsorship offer and warned other potential victims about his practices. I could have reported him to authorities and let the legal system handle his crimes without orchestrating his complete destruction. But when I remember my grandfather's final moments in that barn, alone and ashamed because he could not protect The farm that had been in our family for generations, I know that I made the right choice. Marcus Blackwood was a predator who would have continued destroying families until someone stopped him. The fact that I was the person who stopped him feels like a form of justice that goes beyond what any court could provide. I think about Marcus, sometimes sitting in his prison cell and remembering the life he lost. I wonder if he understands that his downfall began the moment he decided to manipulate a poor farm girl who loved her family more than she feared him. I wonder if he realizes that his greatest mistake was underestimating the power of someone who had nothing left to lose. The secret he whispered in that underground cellar did make my heart collapse, just as he intended. But from the ruins of my shattered innocence, I built something stronger and more dangerous than he ever imagined. I became the kind of person who could match his ruthlessness and exceed his capacity for strategic thinking. Marcus Blackwood taught me that the world contains people who will destroy others for profit, and that such people can only be stopped by someone willing to destroy them in return. It was a harsh lesson, but an important one. I carry that knowledge with me as I continue to investigate and expose others who prey on vulnerable families. My grandfather's death has been avenged, but the work of protecting people like him continues every day. There are other Marcus Blackwoods out there, using different methods, but causing the same kind of harm. My job now is to find them before they can destroy more families, and to make sure they face the same consequences that I brought down on the man who killed my grandfather. The young farm girl who saved a stranger from an underground tomb no longer exists. In her place stands someone harder, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous to those who would exploit the innocent. Marcus Blackwood created his own destroyer when he chose to reveal his secret to someone whose heart was strong enough to survive its collapse. I saved his life once, in that flooded cellar where he was waiting to trap me. But in the end, I was the one who set the trap that would cost him everything he valued. That feels like justice to me, and justice is all I ever really wanted.